common sense in social norms. All right. Now, what is the ultimate goal of the proletariat? Right? It says, not to become a new ruling class, but to abolish ruling classes entirely. On page 20, Marx writes, the proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. Right? Now, this brings us to our what will truly be the final point here. What the proletarian wants to destroy is the idea of private property as appropriation. Whenever we hear Marx, private property discussed in conjunction with Marx, we have to understand that he's talking about private property as appropriation of property. What you produce through your own labor is not property in the same sense, right? But we'll say a little bit more about this. What does Marx mean when he calls for the abolition of private property? This is, again, one of the most controversial and misunderstood and sort of hot-button issues when we're thinking about Marx. Marx says there should be no private property. What does Marx mean by private property? What does the abolition of private property mean? Is Marx saying that a person shouldn't be able to own their own home, own their own laptop, own their own mattress? What is he getting at? He says on page 21, all property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. Marx doesn't think that a change to the way we think about property and private property is unprecedented. He thinks that there have been many changes to the way we think about property, and the abolition of property is not historically unprecedented. Right? The abolition of feudal property gave way to the rise of bourgeois property. And so when he's talking about the abolition of private property, he is talking about the rise of communally owned property, or property that is properly owned, not appropriated. A change in the way that we think about property. And property rights are always sort of being negotiated. We'll talk about property rights in subsequent lectures down the road next week. Right? But we can think about things that are publicly owned, not privately owned now. Right? Roads are publicly owned in many cases. The police department, the fire department, publicly owned, not privately owned. Owned and paid for by taxpayers. Right? Now, there are a lot of debates, obviously, right now about public healthcare, nationalizing healthcare. Should healthcare be a human right? Should it be something that is a publicly funded and publicly, universally available service. Right? For Marx, the answer obviously is yes, right? As all things ought to be. But we could also ask about railroads or oil production. Right? Should these things be privately owned or publicly owned? And we'll talk about the public ownership of natural resources in our final lecture on environmental justice. So the distinguishing feature of communism for Marx is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. Modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products, and is based on class antagonism. Right? Any future understanding of property can't be based on class antagonisms. In this sense, the theory of communism may be summed up in a single sentence. Marx writes, abolition of private property. Now, Marx foresees the objections to this, right? And this is again page 21 and 22. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property? Do you mean the property of petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There's no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is still daily destroying it. Right? So, hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property, that is not what is going to be destroyed. The things that you buy for yourself based on the money you earn from your own production, that is your property. Right? It is not the same as it is now, because under communism it wouldn't be, because it would have been acquired outside the framework of a class struggle. It would have been acquired in a different economic framework. But in any case, the important point is Marx is not saying you have to get rid of all personal effects, right? Anything that is yours, that you own. We don't need to abolish that. You still have your bed frame. You still have your laptop. You still have your house, perhaps, right? If you need to buy a house, right? Perhaps housing would be provided by the state. In any case, right? Your individual property is not what is at stake. Instead, the property that needs to be abolished is the means of production, right? Privately owned factories, privately owned oil wells, privately owned, privately owned corn farms, that sort of thing, right? Those things, those means of production, those entities which require workers to work them, and therefore necessarily require a conflict between owner and worker. Those are the kinds of properties, private property, that need to be abolished. So, Marx, to summarize, and I have written much more in my notes that you can look over if you want to. Marx calls for the end of the bourgeois capitalist state. And he calls for revolution. Now, I guess I'm going to say one more thing. I know we're cutting into almost about to go over, but we've been under